Hello and welcome to Ahval Podcasts, the home of objective, up-to-date and independent reporting on Turkey. Don't forget to follow our reports through social media, on ahvalnews.com or through our mobile app. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to the Ahval Podcast. Today we have Turkey-US relations expert Edward Stafford, who is retired from the U.S. Foreign Service in 2016. His most recent overseas assignment was Counselor for Political and Military Affairs in Ankara between 2011 and 2014. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for your time. Today, I wanted to discuss about obviously Turkey and U.S. relations and also Turkey and Russia relations. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan was in Russia just yesterday again. This time he attended the MAX Air Show, and there were photos that Turkish president was inspecting Russian fighter jets, and also some other photos showing Erdogan and Putin were eating ice cream. What to make of it from these photos yesterday?
Well, I don't think you should tie too much to him having photos taken of himself next to the Russian aircraft. Obviously, the air show that the Russians are doing, like air shows that are put on in other countries, is a marketing device. It is an effort by the Russian defense and aerospace industry to show to prospective customers what it has to offer and to generate interest in their products. This is the same thing that happens in England and happens in suburban Paris, the suburbs of Paris. And that's really the main purpose. Now, I don't think that's the reason that Erdogan went to Moscow, although it's being played up. In fact, in Putin's press statement about the visit of Erdogan, he laid it on thick, as we would say. He spent a lot of time talking about how good it was that Erdogan had accepted Putin's invitation to come to the MAX Air Show. Now, why would he do that? I mean, why would he put so much emphasis on what would have been kind of a routine thing? Well, trying to not speculate, but do a little bit of analysis of it, that's not pure speculation. It seems to me that Erdogan went to Moscow this time as a reaction to the attack on the Turkish convoy that was perpetrated by Syrian government forces, but almost certainly with the knowledge and possibly the assistance of the Russian advisors who are there working with the Syrian government forces. Now, that's in no way certain, but what we do know is that there were 3 civilians killed in that attack on the Turkish convoy, and that the Turkish military and political establishment was really taken aback, shocked and surprised that attack took place. Quite frankly, I think that Erdogan went to Russia to talk to Putin about that attack and what did this really mean for this so-called de-escalation zone in Idlib, and the story of, and then going to the MAX air show is a nice cover. And it's very possible that, yes, he had accepted the invitation a long time ago, so he just went ahead. Now, but, I mean, what's really, I think, going on is that Erdogan had to go and talk to Putin about this attack and try to get a guarantee that it's not going to happen again, because the most disastrous thing that could happen to Erdogan right now politically would be Turkish soldiers or Air Force personnel or anyone, any military personnel or even civilian personnel of the Turkish government who are in Syria being killed by Syrian government forces with the prior knowledge of the attack coming by the Russians. In other words, that the Russians are in some way involved, not with separating Turkish forces from Syrian government forces, but are actually aiding and abetting the Syrian government forces in perpetrating an attack on the Turkish forces. If that happens, Erdogan has a serious problem.
I understand. Yet, only a day later, Mr. Erdogan went to this show in Russia. We saw that airstrikes targeted area near Turkish observation post in Syria's Idlib. I think it was number 10.
Yep, observation post 10.
So does it mean that Assad regime doesn't really care about Erdogan's warnings?
Oh, I don't think. I think Assad realizes that he has nothing to fear from Erdogan and the Turkish military. Assad knows that Putin is going to back him to extend Syrian government control throughout the entire country. He knows that it might take a little while, but Assad's forces cannot really do something in the air without the knowledge of the Russian military who are there. So, every time a helicopter takes off or an aircraft, a fixed-wing aircraft takes off, the Russians know about it. Now, maybe Assad is trying to, create an individual path for his forces separate from the Russians, but that would not be in his interest. Quite frankly, Assad is in power because of Russian assistance. So he's not going to get crosswise with the Russians. I don't think he worries, though, about getting crosswise with the Turks. Now, I think that there's a classic thing called deconfliction, and given proper prior consultation and the sharing of information, you can have airstrikes pretty close to your own forces, but that cause no harm to your own forces. And this, of course, is the other thing that's going on with the United States and Turkey working out a peace zone, as it's now being called, in another part of Syria.
Yes.
So it may be that on the ground, consultations are going on between Turkish military professionals and Syrian and Russians to make sure that as the Syrian government pursues its operations against Syrian opposition in Idlib, it does not come into contact or harm any Turkish forces, and that the strike on the convoy was a mistake. But if it were a mistake, then certainly Erdogan would want to have that assurance from Putin, and that would be another reason, or would have been another topic of conversation up in Russia. So,
yeah. So a little bit more about this Max Air show.
Mhm.
Apparently, Russians displayed various Russian Air Force models, plane jet models. And in Turkish media, mainly it's been discussed that Turkey may go ahead and purchase either Su-57 or Su-35, both of them being discussed. Can you tell us a little more about these two models and whether you think any of this can be an alternative to US-made F-35s?
Yeah, the Su-35 is known as a fourth generation fighter aircraft. It does have some capabilities for ground attack, but it's mainly thought of as a air superiority aircraft. It is kind of comparable. There's two planes in the U.S. inventory that would be comparable to it. The F-16 and then the Boeing F-18. Now, the F-16s are manufactured. There are two places where they're manufactured. One is in Turkey, so it's hard to imagine that anyone would seriously consider buying the Su-35, which is, again, this is very general, roughly comparable to the Lockheed Martin F-16, because Turkey already operates well over 100 F-16s. They have all their pilots trained on them, and of course the way this works in technology is they're being upgraded all the time. So there'd really be no advantage. In fact, there'd be several disadvantages for Turkey to seriously look at the Su-35. So you can just set that aside. The Su-57 is supposed to be stealth capable. And part of that has to do with, it's a complete remake of an aircraft, and it does certain things to, in a sense, hide everything. One of the things you do is you make it like really smooth, so it's a different body, and you essentially incorporate into the interior of the plane the armaments. So instead of, I'm sure you've seen photos where there's missiles hanging down from the wings or things like this. Well, those are actually pretty easy to be picked up by radar. So the Su-57 is supposed to be, we're moving from the fourth generation to the fifth generation of fighter aircraft, and its big item is that it's supposed to be stealthy. No one is sure how stealthy it is. And of course, one of the things that's going on, are these planes actually able to completely evade radar? The big reason the United States does not want Turkey to have F-35s alongside the Russian S-400 air defense system is because those Russian air defense systems have radar, highly sensitive radar, and they could begin to start figuring out how to always find F-35s if they had constant, regular exposure to them flying in Turkey while operating their S-400s, because the S-400s are going to be operated by Russian advisors. They're not going to be operated by Turkish military personnel until they're trained up in them. And in the meantime, those Russian technicians could be gathering all sorts of data and information from the flights of the F-35. So that's why the F-35 has now been suspended, and Turkey's been suspended from the program. How good the Su-57 is, no one knows. Now, what would happen if Turkey were to acquire the Su-57? I think the voices in America and in other NATO countries to in a sense, maybe not kick Turkey out of NATO, but to, in all intents and purposes, suspend them from NATO. In other words, exclude them from conversations in Brussels and at joint planning committees of the military personnel at different places like Naples and elsewhere. But it's hard to imagine that Turkey is going to put the money into the Su-57. One, it's unproven at this point. So to sign a contract for an unproven, because the Russians have only recently started flying even prototypes. So I don't. Now, at the same time, it doesn't hurt Erdogan with his political base to say that, well, we may have lost the F-35, but we have an alternative. One thing about the F-35, if news reports, which were probably leaks, are to be believed, the Israeli Air Force used the F-35 in its strike on Iranian missile depots in Iraq, and were able to execute the operation by evading all of the Iraqi air defense systems. In other words, they were able to carry out the strike and then leave, and yet they did so without being tracked. If that's true, the F-35 is already a proven stealth fighter, whereas the Su-57 is not. But I think the interest that Erdogan showed really was probably directed towards his political supporters to say, look, we have other options beyond the F-35. So if we lose the F-35, it's not such a big deal. We can always go elsewhere.
I understand. You mentioned that Su-57 is not being tested yet. As far as I know, S-400s also not being tested. I mean, is not a combat proven yet, but still Turkey went ahead and purchased that. So wonder how these Su-57 discussions are going to go from this point. Yesterday,
let me just, before you,
sure.
One thing that's important to understand is that the Su-35 was basically an upgrade from the Su-27, which for almost 2 decades the Soviet Union used, and then Russia afterwards. So that was an upgrade. The Su-57 is a completely new sort of aircraft. It has a different exterior, different avionics, engine, so forth and so on. The S-400 is an upgrade of the Russian S-300. So even though it's not battle tested, an earlier version of it has been battle tested. And I think that's one of the reasons the U.S. is so concerned, even though it's not proven, because it's an upgrade. In a sense, it has been proven. I'm sorry, but I just wanted to throw that in. Go ahead.
That was a great point. Thank you. Yesterday, Secretary of Defense Mark Esper talked about. They responded questions from reporters at Pentagon, and there were, I think, 2 questions on Turkey, together with General Danford. They gave the press briefing. I don't know if did you see anything new in those remarks in Esper's yesterday?
No, I mean what I saw was that look, the U.S. did not want to suspend Turkey from the F-35 program, and it's really a decision that was taken most reluctantly, but the military experts were absolutely clear you could not have the F-35s operating regularly in the same airspace that was under the surveillance of the radar on the S-400s. But the way to bring Turkey back into the F-35 program, to which it contributes a number of different components, is for the S-400s to go back to Russia. And, some people have talked about, well, they just won't activate them. No, that's not going to be good enough, because you can activate them very quickly if they're already in place. So, no, it's going to have to be that, that the S-400s go home to Russia, and then we can work out Turkey getting back into the F-35 program.
Obviously, we don't have any signs whatsoever that Turkey is going to send it back, but it appears, at least President Trump is kind of tied to these CAATSA sanctions to activation.
Yeah, my interpretation of what Trump is up to regarding CAATSA is that he will try to do them in as non-punitive a manner as possible. In other words, many people in the White House see getting Turkey out of the F-35 program as enough punishment, if we want to use that word, for Turkey acquiring the S-400s. And that now that Turkey is out of the F-35 program, and it can only come back in by getting rid of the S-400s, it's really not necessary to come up with really punitive sanctions. At the same time, Trump has to deal with Congress, which is probably, well, it certainly has a number of members who really want to hammer Turkey with CAATSA sanctions, not only because of the S-400, but other reasons. So, my guess is that Trump will likely drag his feet on CAATSA, and then when they're imposed, it will be, as how can you say this? I don't want to say gently, but as non-harsh as possible, because there's many people who realize that, the CAATSA sanctions can be punitive against all of Turkey, when in fact, it's not clear that everybody in Turkey, in fact, it's pretty clear that a substantial minority of the people in Turkey would rather not have this cozying up to Russia. So if you play long term, you don't want to alienate all of the Turkish people from the United States and from NATO, and applying CAATSA sanctions as harshly as possible would tend to do that.
I understand. Again, yesterday at Pentagon, Chief of General Staff Stafford was asked about this so-called safe zone in northeast of Syria, and he said that the U.S. and Turkey agreed founding Joint Operations Center, but the issue of joint patrol is coordinated with the Joint Operations Center, and it has not yet set a date for the start of joint patrols. And he used some other, gave little more details that the two countries are working on. Do you see these two countries are going to be able to agree on a safe zone? Because there are two red lines as far as we can see. Last week I was talking to expert Nicholas Harris, and was saying that U.S. would not let Turkey to control this safe zone by themselves. but Turkey has been talking about it, that this safe zone must be under Turkish control. What is your perspective? Do you think Washington and Ankara will find a way to work on this safe zone?
I think ultimately they will, and I think, but it's going to be difficult to get there, and it's going to be made more difficult by the politicians. If this were left entirely in the hands of the military, both of which have senior officers who respect the other side. In other words, senior U.S. officers respect the Turkish military. Senior Turkish military personnel respect the Americans. And they could come down and figure out how to run this joint operations center, which I think is a bit of a misnomer. It really should be called a joint coordination center, because they aren't doing joint operations. And even when they do joint patrols, I don't know if that really rises to the level of the term operations, but fine, we'll call it what it is. Everybody's calling it a joint operations center. But the difficulty is that how long does the United States need to keep military personnel in Syria in order to definitively end the terrorism that emanates from ISIS cells that are still there, mainly underground, of course. I mean, they're no longer operating openly. I mean, but they're still there. And how much longer will Trump continue to listen to his counterterrorism national security staff, both at the Pentagon, the White House, State Department, CIA, everybody else, about the need to keep U.S. forces in Syria? It is well known that Trump would like to bring them all home. And so that's a concern, I think, for those who see, the need to keep an American presence there. And then the other part of this is that how much longer are the Russians and the Syrians going to tolerate the presence of foreign military forces inside their country? It is clear that Assad's goal is to have effective control of the entire country and not to have some, area in the northern part of the country effectively under Turkish control. Now, he's been patient, and he depends upon the Russians to make that ultimate goal arrive. But there's a point at which one can expect that Turkey is going to have to start thinking about what's going to happen when Assad wants to reacquire control of a border strip, a safe zone, a peace corridor, whatever name we're going to put on it, along the border with Turkey. And at the same time, there's pressure on Erdogan to have those joint patrols move forward, if that's the price, to have some sort of safe zone to which Turkey can send back the 3 million plus refugees from Syria that are in Turkey. They are now starting to become a problem for Erdogan. There's a lot of resentment building by different elements of Turkey against all of the Syrian refugees. So a safe zone of some kind is necessary to alleviate the refugee pressure. At the same time, the United States is not going to abandon those people, is not going to abandon those forces that were its de facto battlefield allies against ISIS. Because if they do that, if the United States does abandon the Syrian Defense Forces, which of course has a lot of YPG elements, they will find it very hard next time to find anyone who's willing to work with them.
I understand. I'm coming to the end of our podcast. I have two quick questions here. The one is this recent decision by Interior Ministry, but in reality by the President Erdogan, to dismiss 3 newly elected local mayors, all of them Kurdish.
Right, in the southeast.
Yes, and this just came at the same time Erdogan was talking about intervening northeast Syria before the announcement that Turkey and US agreed on this so-called safe zone. And we saw that the US reaction to this was very big. How do you view U.S. reaction to this this step by the Turkey dismissing democratically elected local governors, mayors?
Well, I think it was very weak. It's, I think, a major disappointment, and I think it was, clearly a mistake. The spokesperson, either from the White House podium or from the State Department, I think the State Department would have been better, should have come out with a strong statement, maybe not condemning, that might not have been the word, but expressing serious concern about the anti-democratic action in the removal of fairly freely elected mayors. And I think the administration did not do that because they were concerned about causing offense to Erdogan or others while they were in the midst of negotiating this joint patrol between, or joint operations center between Turkey and the United States. I think that was one concern. But the other thing is, it has been a standard of the Trump administration, with few exceptions, Iran's one, Venezuela's another, but in all sorts of other places, the Trump administration basically has an attitude of, it's a domestic affair and we're not going to comment. And that's been you've seen this in all sorts of places. Now, at the same time, you have President Trump sending out tweets all the time about what's going on with his friends in this country or that country, or his enemies, or whatever. But as a matter of policy, the United States clearly, since January 2017, has been pursuing a policy to rarely make comment on anti-democratic practices in another country, and relegates it to, well, that's a domestic concern. That's not our business. Yeah, but it is disappointing.
I understand. And finally, new Ambassador Satterfield just presented his credentials to President Erdogan. I think it's going to be tough. What should we expect from his years in Ankara?
Well, I mean, it is going to be tough. Now, David Satterfield Ambassador Satterfield is a highly talented and accomplished career diplomat, and has served successfully in a number of difficult situations. So I think on a personal level, he's going to do well. Now, and I think there's no better manager out there that the United States could have chosen to manage what is going to be a difficult relationship. I mean, the relationship between Turkey and the United States is going to remain difficult. Yes, we have this Joint Operations Center, but that's no panacea. That's no cure for all the problems that ail the relationship. And but Satterfield, I think, he knows how to stay within the lines of protocol, and at the same time to sometimes step out of those when it's necessary to pursue the interests of the United States. I think it's one thing to understand that he is someone who the Turkish foreign minister and also President Erdogan should respect, because he is accomplished. I don't know how good his Turkish is. His Arabic is excellent. So, and he has a familiarity with the region and has for years. So he's going to be a very valuable interlocutor for the Turkish government if they will work with him. In the past, sometimes Erdogan has actually made pejorative comments about the American ambassador, and I think what that reflects is that he doesn't understand that American ambassadors, are there to represent the United States, and sometimes they may say things that are not pleasing to their host, but none of it is ever personal. It is, American ambassadors, if they have personal opinions, they're wise to keep them to themselves. That's one of the first things you learn in the business, which is true of all competent career diplomats. If you have personal opinions, keep them to yourself. Your professional duties and responsibilities are what guide your public statements and interactions with your host. There it is.
Okay, well, thank you so much for this overviewing current issues between two countries, and we are going to hopefully continue to discuss these issues going forward in September coming. New season starts. Let's see what will happen. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Sure, my pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.